So in this video, let's take a look at blue collar and white collar jobs and who's happier. People who work with their hands, people who are in the real world, which is to say they can become conscious or they are conscious of what they're doing, or people who have these strange abstract jobs that sometimes it's hard to tell what they're doing. They sit in cubicles, and you may have one of these jobs and it may seem really strange to be an accountant or something. And when we're asked, what do you do for a living? Humans give a very strange response. We should all give this same response. I breathe, I eat, and I sleep. That's what you do to live. But humans are so unique because we do these strange things like accounting or being a governor or politician. And then that makes money. And then we use the money to survive. And so we have a kind of second step in all of this that most species on the planet simply do not have. And if you're young, it gets because my kids are 16 and 20, and one of the most stressful things they worry about is, what will I do for a living? And that is a question that is very stressful to people. I never really thought much about it when I was 20 or 19. Kind of a little bit maybe with, am I going to continue with music or do something else? But certainly wasn't a cause of anxiety. But it's a big question. I mean, what are you going to do for a living? When you put it like that, it sounds existentially terrifying, because the truth is, all the other species on the planet never had to deal with that. And so when we turn it to blue collar and white collar, it's particularly interesting because there's such a huge opening for blue collar jobs. Things like construction workers and carpenters and stonemasons. And at least if you look at the data, there's plenty of openings for these types of jobs. But we're so seduced by the abstract world. We're not drawn to them anymore. So in other videos, I talk about the appeal, the bliss, the joy of being in the real world. And that's, of course, why we meditate and do mindfulness. But there's a strange paradox, because there's also a stigma in terms of work or jobs against jobs that are in the real world, because, of course, we want to be in the abstract world because that's the world we have created. The abstract world has some status to it, while being in reality simply doesn't. And again, the ever-increasing numbers when it comes to the abstract world, where just take a look at when you ask people, again, they want to be doctors. And to be a doctor today is kind of interesting because you got one foot in the real world because you're kind of a body mechanic. But the other half, and this is just from doctors, physicians that I know, is so bureaucratic, so abstract, that part actually can be pretty frustrating for them. Take a look at academics. I was a professor for 25 years and I loved it, even though it was complete abstraction. But in academia now, there's even greater abstractions called administration. And I'm not quite sure what these people do. I watched as they sort of George Costanza'd their way around. In other words, they wore these suits. They looked stressed out like they were doing a whole lot. But to date, I've never really found out what these people were doing, except living in abstract worlds and trying to convince other people of the reality of this abstraction. But if you look, say, some place like Stanford, I don't know if you've seen these numbers, but now they've got so much administration that there's almost one administrator for each student. And so that really does back up this notion that the abstract world is ever expanding. You could be a lawyer. That's an incredibly abstract job because we made up what's called the law. And so your whole world will be going into an office, living day to day in an abstraction. Same thing with being a politician. So let's look at some of the data, and I did a little research trying to find out who's happier. And there's some problems with the research because, one, they just throw all the blue-collar jobs together, and there's a lot of variability. And so if you've ever done construction, there's a lot, or worked in certain types of factories, it's very hard on the body. And it's different from being, say, an electrician or a plumber, which still can be a little physically taxing, but they're different on a continuum. And so if you just look at, the people who do the number crunching and combine all these different jobs, it does look like the white collar jobs are a little happier. But again, I'd like to see the data if they separated it out and looked at some of the less physically taxing jobs in reality, like, say, being an electrician. Another study I found only looked at blue-collar workers and actually found 86% of them were actually very happy with their job. And that's interesting because they're living in a world that has a certain stigma on these types of jobs because we've elevated the level of abstraction to such a point that to think and abstract is valued, but to be in the real world is less valued. But there are, of course, exceptions. Take Zen. There's a story in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance where the main character is an academic, so he's very abstract, and he's traveling and staying with a friend, as I recall. I get a little of the story wrong, but the point is the same. And the friend distrusts him because of his abstract job. And then they start talking about welding, which of course is in the real world. And he finally trusts him a little bit because, if you're a welder, at least we can relate because we both spend time in the real world. But where I want to go with this is a little bit of a take on Office Space, which I'm talking about the movie from the 90s, which was really funny. It was because they dealt, it was almost prophetic. And they dealt with abstractions like TPS reports. And it was so funny because I was right in the middle of doing something almost exactly the same, where you're doing a report, in this case at academia it was a promotion, and you had to have a certain color page for the first cover letter and then a different color page for the second. And apparently some committee got together and changed the colors of these. And if you didn't have the colors right, they wouldn't even look at your application for promotion. Of course, these TPS reports, it was, a classic scene in the movie. But if you look at what the main message of Office Space was, here's a guy who's totally unhappy, doesn't get it, living in this abstract cubicle world. And then he gets hypnotized, kind of like stop thinking all the time and just be as opposed to thinking. And he starts kind of zenning out a little bit and getting into the real world and without thinking too much. And so he doesn't inhibit his emotions, and that gets him, ironically, actually gets him promoted, at least at first. But ultimately, at the end of the movie, he realizes that none of this is for him. The abstractions are not the way to happiness. And you see him at the end of the movie, he's working for a construction company, and he genuinely seems to be happy there. So really, I don't think the data is really there where we can look and say without doubt who's happier. And so I think it comes more down to just reminding people of the choices that they have. So whenever I talk to someone young, I at least remind them that there are these jobs in the real world. You can make really decent money with them. And if mindfulness and meditation mean anything, then there could be some kind of magic to being in the real world and using that as your job that makes money so then you can survive.